On May 26th, in 1857, Dred Scott got his freedom, which was one small piece of good news amidst a whole lot of the other kind. No. Hold on, you may be saying, wait a minute. Dred Scott, wasn't he the plaintiff in the worst decision the U.S. Supreme Court ever made in Scott versus Sanford? Isn't he the guy who sued for his freedom and the court ruled against him? A sweeping piece of judicial activism that said, in fact, there were no free states anywhere in the United States and that no African American could be a citizen. Isn't this the one that triggered the Civil War? Well, yes, it is, and it was the worst case in American Supreme Court history. I say that being fully aware of Roe versus Wade. But here's the story of Dred Scott, and yes, there is something at least slightly encouraging about it. He was born into slavery to the family of one Peter Blow. Then Blow sold Scott to John Emerson, who's a U.S. Army surgeon, and Emerson took Scott with him in his travels, including to the Free State of Illinois and the Free Territory of Wisconsin. After Emerson died, Scott was inherited by his widow Irene, and in 1848, Scott sued for his freedom after he tried to buy freedom for himself and his family, and Irene Emerson turned him down. It's one of the odd things about slavery, by the way. How can a slave have his own money? What's the deal offering money to your master? Your master owns you. You'd think they'd own your wallet, but American slavery was rather a peculiar institution in a lot of ways. In any event, Scott sued, saying that because he'd been in a free state and a free territory, he had become free at that point since there was no slavery there. And this case wound its way through the Missouri courts, and eventually Scott lost due to some very, very bad judicial rulings. Essentially, they were determined to uphold slavery, and they didn't care about the facts or the law, which just sounds terrible. But here's the odd bright spot. His case was funded by Peter Blow's children. The children of the man who'd originally owned him had become anti-slavery. Well, after he lost in the Missouri courts, he somehow came into the possession of Irene Emerson's brother, that's Sanford, and he lived in New York. So this allowed Scott to bring suit in federal court because he would be a resident of Missouri if he indeed got his freedom, and the defendant was now a resident of a different state of New York. Well, by this point, Peter Blow's children were tapped out, but a number of lawyers were willing to take Scott's case pro bono. Again, a bright spot in what's on the whole a rather dismal story. So finally, the case reaches the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, Irene Emerson has remarried a man named Calvin Chaffee, and he's an abolitionist. And he gets elected to Congress, and people start criticizing him, especially slave owners, saying, oh yeah, you're this big-time abolitionist, but your wife owns Dred Scott. What's that about? And in fact, Chaffee himself goes, I don't know, what is that about? I had no idea about any of this. And then he wrote to Scott's lawyers, and he said, did my wife own this guy? Like, what's the deal here? So, in the middle of all this, the Supreme Court makes this appalling ruling against Dred Scott. But then it turns out somehow Emerson's brother never did own Dred Scott. He really does still belong to Irene Emerson. By now, she's become an abolitionist. And so, because it seems a fitting way to do it, she gives Dred Scott to one of Peter Blow's children so that he can free Scott. And so the nightmare of slavery and plunges the nation into civil war, yes, but Dred Scott does get his freedom. Unfortunately, he dies within 2 years. But what is startling about this, when you look at the course of American slavery, you see far too few people ever did see the light. Realize, and these are people who in many other ways were truly admirable. If you'd known them, you probably would have liked them, except for this problem about slavery. Never did understand that it was wrong. And to me, we look back on this, we can't understand how they could be so blind. And a lot of people feel superior. Oh yes, we have greater enlightenment. To me, it's actually humbling to think if people back then, who were in other ways so admirable, could fail to see this great evil in their own time, what might we be overlooking in our time that's just as bad? And it's also a reminder, it's great to be part of sweeping political movements, to have enlightenment, to be on the side of the righteous and the mighty. But search your heart and see if you can't, like Peter Blow's children or Irene Emerson, realize that something is wrong and be determined, even if you can't stop it in society at large, that you can do the right thing in your personal life, as they did when they defended Dred Scott's freedom and then, despite the Supreme Court, made him a free man on May 26th, back in 1857.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.